Hi YouTube and welcome to my channel. My name is Patrick. Today we're going to compare Windows and Linux to determine which one is the most secure option. So with that being said, let's dig right in. Alright, so first we're going to talk about vulnerabilities. Now vulnerabilities are not the end-all be-all when it comes to measuring security. They are an important aspect and it is something you do want to keep in mind, but it is not the ultimate measure of a system's security. See, vulnerabilities are going to happen. Every piece of software you and I use today has vulnerabilities. Look at old web browsers, for example. Old web browsers are considered very insecure, but the thing about it is that nothing changed. They've always been insecure. The only difference is that we know what those vulnerabilities are now, and the same applies to the software that we use today. So anyway, let's look at some statistics. So I compared Windows 24H2 to Fedora 40. I selected Fedora 40 because it's about the same age as 24H2, and it gives Linux a good representation through a distribution that really focuses on security. So Windows 11 24H2 has had 337 vulnerabilities. That sounds like a lot because it is. But let's look at the average severity of those vulnerabilities. So out of 10, 1 being not severe, 10 being very severe, the average severity was 7.3 for a Windows system. And there's another measurement of vulnerabilities I want to look at called the EPSS. The EPSS is the likelihood that a vulnerability is going to be exploited within 30 days of discovery. The average score was 0.13%. So with Windows, there's a large number of vulnerabilities. They're relatively high severity on average, but they're less likely to be exploited within 30 days of discovery. I want to show you this graph here. So in this graph you can see this is a line graph of all the vulnerabilities that came out for this version of Windows. And you can see the lowest was a little bit more than 4 out of 10, and the highest was a 9.8 out of 10, and there were several instances of that highest number occurring. So let's switch gears and let's look at Linux. So Linux, Fedora Linux 40, has had 142 vulnerabilities, so less than half of what Windows has had, which is very interesting. That means that there's fewer vulnerabilities being found for Fedora Linux than there are for Windows. Now, why is that? Well, that's a topic of hot debate, and I don't know what the answer is. Some people will say, well, because Fedora is open source, it's going to have fewer vulnerabilities because there's more people looking at the code. People will also say that there are more vulnerabilities on Windows because it's much more popular than Fedora Linux, and therefore more people are looking for vulnerabilities. Now, these two things are not mutually exclusive, but I don't know which one of them or if both of them are true. The fact of the matter is, at Microsoft you have some very skilled individuals that are in charge of the code, and the same can be said for the Linux world. So I think that overall they're probably on about equal footing as far as support from their developers go, but it is interesting that Windows has more vulnerabilities than Fedora Linux. I don't know what the reason for that is, but I'll leave that to your discretion. So the average severity for a Fedora Linux 40 vulnerability was 7.8 out of 10, so slightly higher than the average severity of a Windows 11 vulnerability, which is interesting. Also, the EPSS score, the measurement of how likely a vulnerability is to be exploited within 30 days, that was 1.43, which, again, is more likely than Windows, which is interesting. I want to show you this chart for Fedora Linux 40. This shows the severity of vulnerabilities over time for Fedora Linux. And you can see it's not all that different than what we saw with Windows. I mean, the highest are 9.8, the lowest are around 4. And so, all in all, I think there's a couple things we can take away from this. So Fedora Linux has higher severity vulnerabilities, slightly, and about half as many as Windows. Fedora Linux's vulnerabilities are slightly more likely to be exploited than Windows, although both are pretty unlikely. Alright, so that's vulnerabilities, and again, vulnerabilities are not the perfect measure of how secure a system is. There's a lot more that goes into it than that. So let's talk about types of attacks. So we're talking in the context of a desktop computer here. We're not bringing servers into it because that's a completely different discussion. But on a desktop, there are three main types of attacks that are very common these days. You have info stealers, crypto miners, and ransomware. Info stealers do what they say on the tin. They try to steal your information like your login details or card numbers, and then they send that to some guy who's going to use it for nefarious purposes. Crypto miners basically turn your computer into a part of the botnet of computers that are mining cryptocurrency for some bad guy. Ransomware is probably the most devious of the bunch. Ransomware will encrypt all of your files on your system, and it will force you to talk to the bad guy who will try to get you to buy the decryption key from him in exchange for cryptocurrency, which you have to buy with real money, so that's how they make their money. So how does each type of system defend against these types of attacks? Well, Fedora Linux is much less likely to be hit by these attacks. Why is that? Some people will say it's because Linux is by design more secure than Windows. Other people will say that it's because it's less popular than Windows. These two things are not mutually exclusive, but it is very difficult to prove either of them true. I mean, obviously Fedora Linux is less popular than Windows, but I'm not sure if that can be attributed to the lack of attacks of this type that come after it. Fedora does a lot of sandboxing. With Fedora Linux, you're going to be using mostly Flatpaks, and the good thing about Flatpaks is that they're sandboxed. So if some malware compromises your web browser, for example, and your web browser is appropriately sandboxed, well then the damage is going to be limited to what your web browser can touch. Now, this does put a little bit of the responsibility onto the user of the system, because they have to maintain the permissions, and it's a very interesting arrangement. So Fedora actually has fewer built-in protections against these types of attacks than Windows does. The sandboxing is a very powerful tool, and it does go a long way, but let's talk about what Windows has up its sleeve. So, Windows is more likely to be targeted by these types of attacks. Now, some people will say it's because it's more popular, others will say it's because it's less secure. Again, I don't know the answer here. I'm going to leave that up to you. Leave a comment if you know one way or another. But by default, there's no meaningful sandboxing going in Windows. I mean, yes, the kernel is protected and basically a virtual machine that's separate from the rest of user space, but we're talking about attacks that happen on your files almost all exclusively in user space, so that doesn't matter very much. Windows does have some optional features that do defend pretty well, and we'll talk in detail about them later. There's controlled folder access, reputation-based protection, and core isolation, which do go somewhat in the direction of protecting it against these types of attacks, but again, they're optional features. The responsibility for security ends up in the hands of the user. Alright, let's talk about the privacy aspect, because privacy is a facet of security, because in security you have the confidentiality of data, the availability of data, and the integrity of data, and the confidentiality of data is a factor in cybersecurity, so how exactly do these systems keep your data private? Well, Fedora Linux sends almost no telemetry. Telemetry is basically information about what your system is doing. It isn't the contents of your documents or the contents of the messages you send, but it's information about the applications and what they're doing, sans the content. Windows 11 sends a lot of information back to Microsoft and to Microsoft's partners, which are a lot of companies. So when it comes to privacy, I mean, Windows and Microsoft will say that they respect your privacy, they'll say that it's important to them, but their actions really show that it's not such a big deal to them. I mean, privacy is very difficult to achieve in Windows 11, especially when you compare it to something like Fedora Linux, where it is just far beyond Windows in terms of privacy. If you want privacy, your best bet's going to be going with Linux. So let's compare some security features between Fedora Linux and Windows. So both of them have a firewall, which is enabled by default in Fedora Linux and in Windows, so that's good. Fedora Linux has a mandatory access control system called SE Linux. This defines what applications have access to and when they can access that information. This prevents some common types of attacks where you might try to leverage the permissions of one program to impact user space, which is a good thing. Windows doesn't have something exactly like that. It does have memory integrity. It prevents user space from communicating with the kernel in a direct way. Fedora and Windows both have full disk encryption. Fedora's is called Lux, and Windows is called BitLocker. Now, BitLocker on Windows uses your built-in TPM chip next to your processor. Now, what that means is that when you start up your Windows computer, it's going to unencrypt itself automatically. Now, the difference is, with Fedora, the default behavior is to use a separate password. So when you start up your Fedora Linux machine, you have to type in one password to decrypt it, and a second password to log in. Personally, I prefer the Fedora Linux approach. Now, you can configure Fedora Linux to use the TPM, but hear me out. I prefer to have to type in that password in order to decrypt my disk, because then I know for sure that somebody with physical access isn't going to be able to get into my data. Now, there is convenience with the Windows implementation, but both of them protect you from somebody taking the disk out of the computer and plugging it into theirs to take your data. It just depends on your threat model which one is best for you. Fedora has very robust sandboxing. It prevents software from accessing things that it doesn't have permission to at the end of the day. There's more to it than that, but that's the context of it in a security point of view. Fedora also has something called Exec Shield. Now, Exec Shield is a way to prevent common software exploits like heap corruption or buffer overflows. And Fedora also has restricted kernel memory access, so this prevents things in user space accessing and modifying the memory of the kernel, which is critical when you want to have system-wide security. Windows does have a few extra features. There's controlled folder access. What this does is it makes it so that programs by default will not be allowed to access your documents, your desktop, and your pictures folders, which is really nice. You have to enable it manually, it doesn't come default, but it is very useful. Windows also has browser and app control. It's another optional feature, but it prevents malicious applications or potentially unwanted applications from being installed and being able to hijack your default apps for different file types. There's also Windows Hello. So Windows Hello is a way that Windows implements biometrics. You can get biometrics working in Fedora, but it's much more difficult. Windows Hello just works out of the box. For example, I have a fingerprint reader on my T480. I can get it working in Fedora Linux, but it's a huge pain in the ass. Windows, however, it just works out of the box. And then Windows has reputation-based protection. Basically, if you try to install software on your Windows machine that has not been used by many people and could be malicious, it's going to block it. Which is good if you download crap all the time from random websites. But look, at the end of the day, both of these systems are more secure than the systems we've had in the past. Both of these systems are vulnerable in ways we don't understand yet, both of these systems will be considered extremely vulnerable in the next 5 years. So at the end of the day, there's a few things that you need to do. You need to keep your computer up to date. Again, the software we're using today is vulnerable. We just don't know how. But we're going to find out. And so you have to keep your machine up to date. Another thing you have to do is be conscious of what code you're running on your system. I'm not saying you have to sit down and look at the code for every piece of software you want to run, but just be cognizant of who wrote the software. Where does it come from? Is this person reputable? Is this company reputable? Does it have any red flags? Like asking for admin access when it doesn't need it. At the end of the day, only you are responsible for your computer's security. Microsoft is not responsible for it. The Fedora team is not responsible for it. You have to take ownership of securing your systems because nobody else is going to do it for you. So be careful, scrutinize everything, read everything that pops up. I see a lot of the time people will be using a computer and something will pop up and they'll just hit yes to get rid of it as quickly as possible. I think this stems from the fact that in the past people tried to use computers very quickly as a sign of intelligence, but the true sign of intelligent computer use is taking time to read the messages that appear on your screen and scrutinize them and ask yourself, does this make sense? And being able to answer that question of does this make sense requires understanding of the context. And again, this is why computer literacy is so important. This is why I made this channel, because I'm trying to educate people on cybersecurity, and it's important to me that we educate people so that they have the context necessary to scrutinize what their computer is doing and ask the question, does it make sense? Anyway, thank you for watching. My name was Patrick. I very much appreciate you taking time to watch this little video. I recently hit 2,200 subscribers, which is huge for me. I know it's a small channel, but that's a big deal for me. I never thought this many people would care to hear what I had to say. I'm very grateful for all of you who have watched, especially grateful for those of you who have subscribed. And please, if I got something wrong, leave a comment down below. I'm going to pin a comment at the top that has a summary of all the corrections that you guys give me, because I can't get everything right. But yeah, at the end of the day, security is your responsibility. Thank you for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.